Hey guys, tonight we are delving into something so familiar, so utterly mundane, that you've probably never given it a second thought. Imagine, if you will, your hand reaching for your trusty fork at dinner, that sleek, multi-pronged marvel of engineering. Now, picture a world without it. A world where your fingers, a spoon, and perhaps a sturdy knife are your only allies in the noble quest to get food from plate to mouth. You're at a grand torch-lit feast, the air thick with the aroma of roasting meats and mysterious, bubbling stews. Everyone's digging in with gusto, and there's not a fork in sight. Honestly, with the table manners of yore, you probably wouldn't survive this scene with your appetite or your tunic entirely intact. We're about to embark on the surprisingly slow, often resisted, and occasionally controversial journey of the humble dinner fork. It's a tale of shifting customs, royal whims, and the gradual realization that maybe, just maybe, stabbing your food with a miniature trident isn't such a bad idea after all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop a comment below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself drifting back, way back, to a time when the clatter of a fork against a plate was a sound yet to be invented, a symphony waiting for its instruments. You're sitting, perhaps, on a low-cushioned bench, the scent of wood smoke and herbs filling your nostrils. Before you, a low table groans under the weight of shared platters. See that roasted bird, gloriously golden, isn't it? And how do you partake? Well, you reach out, your fingers deftly tearing a piece from the communal offering. There's a certain directness to it, an unpretentious connection with your sustenance. No intermediaries, no polished steel getting in the way. Just you and the meal. Across from you, a portly gentleman is enthusiastically tackling a joint of meat. He wields his personal knife, a formidable tool he likely carries everywhere, much like you might carry your smartphone today. He uses it to slice off manageable chunks, then pops them into his mouth with his fingers. His other hand might steady the joint or perhaps clutch a hunk of coarse bread, a built-in napkin and pusher, all in one. Spoons, of course, are present. They've been around since time immemorial, fashioned from wood, shell, or bone, perfect for soups, stews, and anything remotely liquid. You see people using them, scooping up thick, bubbling pottages from a shared cauldron. You try not to think too hard about how many other spoons have already dipped into that same pot. It's all part of the charm, you suppose, this cozy, communal approach to nourishment. The mainstream historical fact is that for much of human history, individual place settings were a rarity. Most people ate from communal bowls and platters, using their hands, a knife, and a spoon. This wasn't just for the common folk. Even in relatively well-to-do households, the idea of everyone having their own separate array of eating implements was a later development. The knife was king, a truly multi-purpose implement. It was your weapon, your crafting tool, and yes, your primary eating utensil alongside your God-given fingers. You would use the point to spear a piece of meat or cheese, and the blade to cut it. Polite society, such as it was, dictated that you didn't lick your knife too ostentatiously, nor would you use it to pick your teeth at the table. Well, not if high-status guests were present anyway. Using the same knife to scratch your head and then spear a pickle was probably frowned upon even then, or at least one hopes so. You observe the scene, noticing the little details. The bread, for instance. It's not just for eating. Thick slices of older, stale bread, known as trenchers, are sometimes used as makeshift plates. You pile your food onto this edible platform, and once you're done, you might eat the gravy-soaked trencher yourself, give it to the dogs who are patiently, or not so patiently, waiting under the table, or perhaps it would be given to the poor. Waste not, want not, especially when your plate is also part of the meal. It's the ultimate in eco-friendly dining, really, though perhaps a bit on the soggy side by the end of the course. Now, for a quirky tidbit, elaborate hand-washing rituals were incredibly important, precisely because everyone was eating with their hands. Before the meal, and often between courses, servants would circulate with basins of scented water, perhaps infused with rose petals or lavender, and linen towels. You dip your fingers, a little flourish of cleanliness before diving back into the shared feast. It was a practical necessity, of course, given the lack of individual cutlery, but also a mark of good breeding. You can imagine the silent judgment if someone skipped the hand-washing and went straight for the greasiest part of the mutton. Some things, it seems, are timeless. You might lean back just for a moment and ponder the sheer efficiency of it all. No endless washing up of countless forks. No agonizing over which of the 7 tiny specialized implements to use for the jellied eel. Just straightforward hands-on engagement. Though if you had a particularly messy stew, you might find yourself wishing for something a little more precise than your fingers or a spoon that's seen better days. Historians still argue whether the eventual shift away from such intensely communal eating styles was driven more by evolving notions of hygiene, a growing desire for personal space and possessions, or perhaps the influence of new culinary trends that simply didn't lend themselves well to finger food. Was it a fear of your neighbor's grubby mitts in the stew? Or did people just start craving a bit more elbow room and their very own uncontaminated portion? The debate, like a good medieval pottage, continues to simmer. You watch as a particularly enthusiastic diner nearby attempts to convey a slippery piece of fruit to his mouth using only his fingers and a small, sharp knife. It's a precarious operation, a true test of dexterity. One wrong move and that fig is heading for the floor, much to the delight of the aforementioned dogs. You can't help but think that a small, pointed implement, perhaps with a couple of tines, might be rather useful in such a situation. But such thoughts are alien here. The idea of a dedicated table fork, a personal implement just for spearing food and bringing it to your mouth, is still far off in the distant future for most of the world you're currently visiting. For now, you pass the communal salt cellar, carefully using the provided small spoon, not your fingers, thank you very much, and prepare for the next course, wondering what new digital, as in pertaining to fingers, adventure awaits. The thought of trying to eat spaghetti in this environment is enough to make you mildly anxious, even in this sleepy, drifting state. Your senses adjust, the smoky air of the medieval hall giving way to something warmer, perhaps a touch more arid, scented with olive oil and roasting herbs. You're drifting further from the familiar, witnessing the distant ancestors, the ancient pointed precursors to the fork, you know. These aren't your elegant, balanced dining companions. Oh no, these are more like the rugged, burly great-great-uncles of the fork family. Tools with a purpose, certainly, but lacking the refined table manners you've come to expect. You are no longer surprised by the absence of individual forks at the table. Your previous experience has well prepared you for the hands-on approach to dining. Instead, your attention is drawn to the hearth, to the bustling activity of food preparation, and to the serving of grand communal dishes. Imagine yourself in an ancient Egyptian villa, the walls adorned with vibrant paintings. A feast is being prepared. You see cooks using long, slender rods of bronze, some with 2 prongs at the end, to lift sizzling pieces of duck or fish from the fire. These are working tools, extensions of the cook's arm, designed to handle hot food without scorching fingers. They are practical, robust, and entirely unconcerned with the delicate art of conveying a single pea to one's mouth. If you tried to eat your salad with one of these, you'd likely skewer your own tongue or accidentally spear your neighbor's ear. They're just not built for that kind of precision work at a crowded table. It's a bit like trying to type on your phone wearing oven mitts. The scale is all wrong for finesse. Or perhaps you find yourself in ancient Greece at a symposium. Men are reclining on couches, talking, drinking wine. Large platters of roasted lamb or goat are brought in. The host, or a designated carver, might use a substantial fork-like implement, more of a serving spit, really, to hold the joint steady while carving off portions with a sharp knife. These tools, often made of iron or bronze, were essential for managing large, unwieldy pieces of cooked animal. The mainstream historical fact here is that while ancient civilizations, including the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, did indeed use these long, often two-pronged, fork-like implements, they were primarily for cooking, carving, and serving. They were kitchen tools or serving utensils, not part of an individual's place setting for the most part. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of barbecue tongs or a carving fork, indispensable for the chef or server, but not something you'd typically find next to every diner's wine cup. You might observe someone using a smaller pointed tool, perhaps a sharpened piece of bone or a slender bronze skewer, to pick up a date or a piece of preserved fruit. These are closer, perhaps, to the idea of a personal eating utensil, but still quite specialized and not in widespread use for the main part of the meal. It's a delicate dance, this selective use of pointed implements. Most of the food, the bread, the olives, the vegetables, the smaller pieces of meat, is still conveyed by hand or with a spoon. These early forks are more like specialists, called in for specific tasks that fingers alone can't quite manage without a sticky mess or a burn. Now, for a quirky little tidbit from the depths of time, archaeologists have unearthed small, sometimes ornate, pointed implements made from materials like bone, ivory, or even precious metals like silver in ancient tombs or settlement sites. Some of these are quite petite, clearly not designed for wrestling a leg of mutton from a fire. Their exact purpose is often a source of gentle speculation. Were they cosmetic tools, perhaps for applying kohl around the eyes? Were they used for specific delicate food items like snails or shellfish? Or did they have some ritualistic significance now lost to us? It's like finding a single mysterious button at an archaeological dig. You know it fastens something, but what and how remains tantalizingly out of reach. This leads us to one of those wonderful open scholarly debates. Archaeologists and culinary historians still debate whether some of the smaller, more ornate, pointed artifacts found from this era were purely ceremonial, tools for personal grooming, or genuinely represent the nascent stirrings of a personal eating utensil for select delicacies. Could it be that in some quiet corner of the ancient world, someone, tired of sticky fingers from honeyed figs, independently fashioned a tiny personal skewer, a proto-fork, if you will? The evidence is sparse, like crumbs from a long-vanished feast, leaving room for imagination and scholarly disagreement. It's a much more polite debate than who gets the last piece of roasted dormouse, thankfully. You watch as a servant in a Roman villa expertly uses a two-pronged bronze lifter to arrange hot appetizers on a serving dish. The skill is undeniable, but it's a world away from the personal, individual fork. If you were to present one of these ancient Romans with a modern dinner fork, they'd probably admire its craftsmanship, then perhaps try to use it to toast something over a lamp, or maybe even to scratch that unreachable itch between their shoulder blades. The concept of it being a primary tool for eating an entire meal themselves would likely seem quite novel, perhaps even a little unnecessary. Why use this delicate little thing when I have perfectly good fingers and a trusty knife? They might wonder, and frankly, from their perspective, it's a fair question. The materials themselves tell a story. bronze, iron, bone. These are materials of strength, of utility. The design is often simple, functional. You might see some decorative elements on the handles of implements used by the wealthy, a carved motif perhaps, but the business end is all about doing its job, spearing, holding, lifting. The idea of a fork as a status symbol, as an item of conspicuous consumption, is still largely in the future. For now, these tools are workers, not show ponies. You feel the imagined weight of a bronze skewer in your hand, its surface cool and smooth, and appreciate its straightforward honesty. It's not pretending to be anything other than what it is, a useful pointed object in a world that still largely eats by hand. The journey to your familiar, slender dining fork is still a long and winding one, and these ancient precursors are just the very first tentative steps on that path. The robust, utilitarian feel of ancient iron and bronze slowly fades, replaced by something altogether more refined, more glittering. Your journey carries you forward in time, eastward into the heart of an empire known for its opulence, its intricate rituals, and its shimmering gold. You find yourself in Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that endured for 1,000 years after the West had, well, rather publicly unraveled. The air here is different. It's alive with the murmur of Greek, the distant chant of choirs, and the faint, sweet scent of incense mixed with exotic spices. Remember those sturdy, almost agricultural, pointed tools you saw earlier? The ones you wouldn't trust near your face without a spotter. Forget them. Here, something new, something much more delicate is beginning to make an appearance, at least in certain circles. You are perhaps an observer in a wealthy Byzantine household, or maybe even catching a glimpse of the imperial court. The dining setting is lavish. Tables are draped with rich silks, and the tableware includes beautifully crafted pottery, glass, and items of silver and gold. And there, nestled amongst the ornate spoons and knives, you spot them. Small, elegant, often two-pronged forks. These are not the hefty skewers of ancient Rome or Egypt. These are slighter, more delicate implements, their tines looking almost dainty. The mainstream historical fact is that the Byzantine Empire, particularly its sophisticated upper echelons, is widely credited with the pioneering use of these small forks as personal eating utensils, centuries before they found any sort of acceptance in Western Europe. They were an innovation, a step towards the cutlery set you might recognize, though still a very early one. Imagine a noblewoman, her fingers adorned with rings, delicately using such a fork. She isn't wrestling with a massive joint of meat. These little forks weren't designed for heavy lifting. Instead, she might be using it to pick up a piece of preserved fruit, glistening with syrup, or a morsel of sweet cake, or perhaps a carefully cut piece of meat that has been doused in a rich, aromatic sauce. The primary advantage, you see, was cleanliness. In a society that valued refinement and elaborate costume, keeping one's fingers free from sticky substances or grease was highly desirable. These little forks, sometimes called ouche by scholars, though the exact terminology for everyday eating forks is a bit of a linguistic puzzle, were tools of distinction, helping to maintain an air of decorum and elegance at the table. It's rather hard to look imperial when you've got fig jam all the way up to your elbows. Now for a quirky or perhaps rather logical tidbit. These early Byzantine forks were often crafted from precious metals. Silver was common, and for the truly wealthy or imperial family, gold forks were not unheard of. They were sometimes part of a dowry or given as important gifts, signifying status as much as serving a practical purpose. You can almost picture one, slender and gleaming, perhaps with an intricately carved ivory or rock crystal handle. They were beautiful objects in their own right, almost like pieces of jewelry. One might even jest that if you dropped one in the thick carpet, it could be mistaken for an earring backing or a particularly ornate hairpin, leading to a frantic whispered search under the table so as not to disrupt the stately flow of the banquet. The use of these forks wasn't universal, not by a long shot. Common folk in Byzantium, much like their counterparts elsewhere, continued to eat primarily with their hands, spoons, and knives. The fork was an indulgence of the elite, a marker of their sophisticated, somewhat Eastern-influenced lifestyle. If a rugged Viking trader or a Frankish knight had stumbled into a Constantinopolitan banquet and seen these nobles delicately picking at their food with tiny golden implements, they probably would have snorted into their wine, viewing it as terribly effeminate or ridiculously impractical. Why use a gilded toothpick when good old fingers have served us perfectly well for generations? They might have grumbled, before tearing into a chicken leg with uninhibited gusto. Debate continues among Byzantinists regarding the extent of fork usage across different social strata in the empire, or whether their primary significance was more symbolic of status and refinement than purely utilitarian for everyday meals for a wider population. Were they used for every course by those who owned them, or reserved only for specific types of food that were particularly messy? Did their presence truly change how meals were structured, or were they more of a fashionable accessory for the very rich, a bit like owning a pet cheetah? Impressive but not strictly necessary for daily life. The full picture remains somewhat hazy, pieced together from archaeological finds, mentions in wills or inventories, and occasional depictions in art. You observe a courtier carefully selecting a candied apricot with his two-tined silver fork. He handles it with a practiced ease, a small, precise movement. There's no risk of sticky fingers, no unseemly grabbing. It's all very controlled, very civilized, at least by the standards they were setting. Compared to the hearty, hands-first approach you witnessed in earlier times, this is a significant shift. It's a small step for a man, perhaps, but a rather notable leap for fork kind. These Byzantine forks, with their delicate tines, represent a clear departure from the large, all-purpose skewers and lifters of antiquity. They are unmistakably personal, designed for the individual diner, even if that diner belonged to a very exclusive club. The idea that one might possess their own special tool specifically for conveying food to the mouth was taking root, nurtured in the opulent soil of the Eastern Empire, while much of the West was still, metaphorically speaking, eating with its hands and occasionally wiping them on the dog. The journey of our humble fork is slowly, very slowly, inching forward. Your gaze, still shimmering with the golden hues of Constantinople, now drifts westward, across the sometimes choppy, sometimes sparkling waters of the Adriatic Sea. You find yourself drawn towards a city rising improbably from the lagoon, a place of bustling trade, maritime power, and a unique blend of East and West. Venice. The air here is damp, carrying the scent of salt, fish, and the faint, ever-present aroma of the canals. While Venice was a republic that prided itself on its worldly connections and commercial acumen, some innovations, it seems, were just a step too far, especially when they arrived in the luggage of a foreign princess. Remember those delicate, two-tined forks you saw being used with such serene elegance in Byzantium? Their first major foray into Western Europe was, to put it mildly, not exactly a welcome parade. You are now a witness to a rather infamous episode, a wedding that became a legend for all the wrong reasons. The mainstream historical fact, oft repeated, concerns a Byzantine princess. Her name is sometimes given as Maria Argira Paulina, arriving around the year 1004 to marry Giovanni Orseolo, the son of the Venetian doge. Other accounts might mention a Theodora Doukaina a bit later, but the core of the story remains strikingly similar. This noble woman, accustomed to the refined dining habits of the Byzantine court, brought with her a trousseau that included, among other luxurious items, small golden forks. She didn't think twice about using them at her wedding feast and subsequent meals, expecting perhaps to continue the civilized practices of her homeland. Oh, how wrong she was. The Venetian court, and particularly the clergy, were utterly scandalized. Imagine the scene, the lavish banquet, the Doge and his retinue, the Venetian nobility in their somewhat more robust finery compared to the flowing silks of Byzantium. And there's the princess, perhaps looking a trifle homesick, delicately picking at her food with her personal golden fork. Instead of admiration for her refinement, there are whispers, sideways glances, and outright disapproval. You can almost hear the muttered comments. What is this affectation? Are her fingers not good enough for God's food? Such decadence! It was seen not as a practical tool for cleanliness, but as an instrument of shocking vanity and an affront to good, simple Venetian ways. It probably didn't help that she also reportedly used perfumed water for her hands and had eunuchs to wait on her, further marking her as excessively and suspiciously foreign. The reaction wasn't just quiet disapproval, it became a matter of theological consternation. The most famous condemnation came from St. Peter Damian, a cardinal and a rather stern reformer. He saw the princess's use of a fork as a symbol of her moral decay and excessive pride. For a quirky, or rather alarming, tidbit, he reportedly preached that God in his wisdom provided man with natural forks, his fingers, and that to substitute these with artificial metallic instruments was a sign of offensive luxury and a perversion of divine intent. When, tragically, the princess died of the plague a few years later, Damien and others were quick to point to it as divine retribution for her sinful, fork-wielding ways. Yes, you heard that right. Death by cutlery. It seems a bit harsh, even for the 11th century. One shudders to think what Damien would have made of a spork, or those little plastic swords they put in cocktails. Historians quibble over the precise identity of the princess involved, as similar stories of fork-bearing Byzantine brides scandalizing their new Western European homes are attributed to more than one noblewoman arriving in Italy around this period, making it a potent symbol of cultural clash, rather than a single, isolated incident. It highlights a fascinating cultural divide. What was seen as refined in the East was perceived as decadent and even sinful in the West. It's as if the fork, this simple tool, became a lightning rod for anxieties about foreign influence, luxury, and perceived effeminacy. You can almost picture the Venetian matrons shaking their heads, muttering about the downfall of society, all because a young woman from a distant land preferred not to get her fingers sticky with Venetian eel. This Venetian wedding scandal serves as a stark reminder that the journey of the fork was not a smooth, linear progression towards universal acceptance. It was bumpy, met with resistance, and often colored by cultural misunderstandings and moral panic. The idea that an eating utensil could provoke such a strong reaction, accusations of vanity, sinfulness, even being an instrument of the devil. Some later critics felt the two tines were reminiscent of a demon's pitchfork. Seems almost comical from your modern vantage point, where a fork is just a fork. But in a world where custom, tradition, and religious interpretation held immense sway, any deviation from the norm could be viewed with deep suspicion. One wonders what other horrifying Byzantine customs the princess might have tried to introduce, perhaps suggesting that bathing more than once a month wasn't actually a sin. The mind boggles. So, the fork, having made its delicate debut in Byzantium, essentially tripped and fell flat on its face at the gates of Western Europe. Its association with foreignness, decadence, and even divine punishment would linger for centuries, casting a long, two-pronged shadow over its future prospects. The journey to becoming a staple of the Western dining table was going to be a much slower, more arduous process than one might imagine, all thanks to this rather dramatic and unfortunate introduction in the canals of Venice. The little golden forks, once symbols of Byzantine refinement, were now, in the West, tainted with the aroma of scandal and brimstone. The echoes of Venetian disapproval and whispers of divine retribution for fork-related hubris begin to fade, though not entirely as your focus drifts across the Italian peninsula. You find yourself immersed in the vibrant, intellectually charged atmosphere of the Renaissance. Cities like Florence, Ferrara, and Urbino are buzzing with artistic fervor, philosophical debates, and a renewed fascination with classical antiquity. Amidst all this cultural blossoming, our humble and still rather controversial fork is attempting a slow, tentative comeback, or perhaps more accurately, a very cautious infiltration. It's a period of magnificent banquets, of new culinary explorations, and an increasing emphasis on refined manners. Yet the fork is still tiptoeing around the edges of the dining table, like an uninvited guest unsure of its welcome. You observe a wealthy merchant's dinner party in Florence. The table is laden with an impressive array of dishes, testament to the host's prosperity and good taste. There are spoons, certainly, and knives are ubiquitous, still the primary personal tool for many. But here and there you might spot a fork, not in front of every guest and not used for every dish. Its presence is hesitant. The mainstream historical fact is that during the Italian Renaissance, from the 14th through the 16th centuries, the use of the fork did gradually increase, but it was a slow burn, largely confined to the upper echelons of society. It was often viewed as an affectation, a sign of perhaps too much delicacy, even a touch effeminate, especially by those clinging to more traditional, robust notions of masculinity. Real men spear their meat with a manly knife, not that dainty little spiker. You can almost hear some traditionalist grumble under his breath while expertly twirling pasta with his fingers. Courtesy books, those fascinating guides to proper aristocratic behavior that became popular during this period, began to occasionally mention the fork. These manuals on etiquette instructed young nobles on everything from how to enter a room gracefully to how to conduct polite conversation, and, increasingly, how to navigate the complexities of the dining table. The fork started to appear in these discussions as an attribute of the refined individual, someone who was sprezzatura personified, that wonderful Italian concept of studied nonchalance, making the difficult look effortless. Of course, looking effortlessly elegant while trying to manage a slippery noodle with a two-pronged novelty item was an art form in itself. One wrong flick, and that saucy strand could end up decorating your neighbor's elaborate silk ruff, which probably wasn't covered in Chapter 1 of How to Impress at Court. For a quirky and rather practical tidbit, the initial acceptance of the fork in Renaissance Italy was often linked to specific types of food that were particularly challenging or messy to eat, with just fingers and a spoon. Think of sticky candied fruits, syrupy desserts, or indeed the burgeoning varieties of pasta that were becoming popular. Using a fork for these items helped maintain a degree of cleanliness and decorum, preventing noble fingers from becoming unpleasantly gooey. There might have been intricate, unspoken rules about how one should hold and use this novel utensil. Grasping it too tightly might look clumsy, while wielding it with an overly theatrical flourish could mark you as a pretentious show-off. It was a delicate social dance, trying to appear sophisticated without looking like you were trying too hard with this newfangled gadget. You watch a young nobleman recently returned from a visit to a more progressive court, tentatively employing his personal silver fork. He uses it for a piece of preserved quince, his movements a little stiff, overly conscious. Older guests at the table might observe him with a mixture of amusement, suspicion, and perhaps a grudging curiosity. Is this the way of the future? Or just another fleeting fad imported by the youth? Renaissance scholars continue to explore the subtle interplay between the fork's adoption and the evolving concepts of individual refinement and bodily comportment, questioning whether the fork drove new manners or if new manners, with their emphasis on cleanliness and control, created a space for the fork to slowly gain acceptance. Was it the tool that changed the person, or the changing person who finally cautiously reached for the tool? The hesitation wasn't just about practicality or tradition. There was still that lingering shadow from its scandalous debut. While direct accusations of satanic influence might have lessened somewhat since St. Peter Damian's fiery pronouncements, the fork could still be seen as a symbol of excessive luxury or foreign foppery, especially in a society that, for all its artistic brilliance, also valued certain forms of Stoic classicism. It's a bit like today, perhaps, if someone brought an absurdly complicated piece of new technology to a quiet, traditional dinner. It might be admired for its ingenuity, but also subtly judged for its unnecessary complexity or showiness. Do we really need that? So, while Italy was busy redefining art, literature, and science for the Western world, its relationship with the fork was more of a slow courtship than a passionate embrace. It was a dance of one step forward, half a step back. The fork was present, yes, but it hadn't yet earned its permanent, unquestioned place at the table. It was still an item to be considered, to be deployed with discretion, its use often saying as much about the diner's aspirations to sophistication, or their perceived pretentiousness, as it did about their desire to eat their pomegranates without staining their fingers. The path to widespread acceptance remained long and full of subtle social negotiations, each cautiously speared morsel a tiny victory for our persistent utensil. Leaving the sun-drenched palazzos and cautious fork-wielders of Renaissance Italy behind, your awareness drifts northward, crossing the formidable Alps, and settles in the Kingdom of France. It's the mid-16th century, a time of powerful monarchs, simmering religious tensions, and a French court eager to establish its own unique brand of magnificence. You arrive, as it were, just in time for a significant royal wedding in 1533, that of the young Catherine de' Medici, a Florentine noblewoman, to Henry, the Duke of Orleans, who would later become King Henry II of France. And with Catherine, according to a very persistent and popular legend, came a wave of Italian sophistication, including, supposedly, our still-evolving friend, the dinner fork. But as you observe the scene, you ponder whether Catherine truly championed this utensil into French hearts and onto French tables, or if the story, like a well-aged wine, has perhaps gained a little extra flavor in the telling. The French court of this era was already a place of considerable pomp, but its table manners, by some Italian standards, might have seemed a touch robust. The use of fingers was still widespread. Knives were the go-to implement, and while spoons were common for liquids, the fork was largely an alien concept. So, when young Catherine arrived with her Italian entourage, her cooks, and her reputed collection of silverware, including these curious little two-pronged items, it must have raised a few eyebrows. The mainstream historical fact is that Catherine de' Medici's marriage is often cited as a pivotal moment for the introduction of refined Italian dining customs, and allegedly the fork, to France. The narrative suggests that her sophisticated Florentine tastes gradually began to influence French cuisine and etiquette. However, just as in Italy, the adoption of the fork in France was an incredibly slow and drawn-out affair, making the Catherine brought the fork story a subject of considerable discussion. Imagine the scene. The young Italian bride, perhaps a little overwhelmed by her new surroundings, attempting to maintain the dining habits she was accustomed to. She might have used her personal small forks for certain dishes. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, consider that these forks, if she indeed brought a significant number, were likely still the small, delicate, two-tined variety, probably made of silver or gold, and intended more for picking at preserved fruits, sweetmeats, or other dainty morsels that would otherwise soil her royal fingers. It's unlikely she arrived with a full set of heavy-duty dinner forks ready to tackle a haunch of venison. The initial French reaction might have been less about the forks themselves and more about the general Italianness of her entourage and customs. Perhaps they were more fascinated or even perplexed by new ingredients like artichokes or the unfamiliar structure of her meals than by the discreet use of a tiny fork by a handful of Italians. They might have initially viewed the fork as just another peculiar foreign trinket, maybe a fancy toothpick or an overly elaborate skewer for a single grape. The truth of Catherine's impact on fork adoption is a favorite topic for lively discussion. Food historians vigorously debate the extent of Catherine de' Medici's direct influence on popularizing the fork in France versus a more gradual, complex cultural osmosis, with some suggesting its widespread adoption came much later and through different channels entirely. Did her personal use truly spark a trend, or was it more that France, like other parts of Europe, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, moving towards more individualized dining practices anyway? Attributing such a major shift in national custom to one person, even a queen, might be a bit like saying a single swallow makes a summer, or in this case, a single fork makes a refined dining culture. It's a romantic notion, certainly a good story. You can picture the initial encounters. A French courtier, accustomed to using his dagger-like knife for most operations, observing an Italian member of Catherine's retinue delicately employing a fork. The Frenchman might have seen it as an amusing novelty, or perhaps even a sign of unmanly daintiness. Why use that little poker, he might have thought, when I can hoist this entire quail to my lips with my bare hands after a quick slice with my trusty blade? There was no immediate rush to abandon centuries of tradition. The fork, even if present at some very exclusive royal tables, would have been seen as an Italian oddity for a long time. Perhaps something you'd try out in private to see what all the fuss was about, like trying to learn a new dance step when nobody's watching. The narrative of Catherine as the great fork bringer also has to contend with the fact that even in Italy, as you've seen, the fork was still far from universally adopted during her youth. It was still largely an elite affectation, used with hesitation. So, to imagine her single-handedly revolutionizing French table manners with an implement that her own countrymen were still ambivalent about requires a generous pinch of salt, or perhaps a delicate scoop with a tiny two-pronged fork. It's more probable that any forks present in her retinue were personal items used by her and her closest Italian companions, rather than a concerted effort to convert the entire French nobility to fork-based dining overnight. The process was likely much more subtle, a slow diffusion of an idea rather than a royal decree. The evidence for her direct transformative impact can sometimes feel a bit like finding a single fossilized strand of spaghetti in the gardens of the Louvre and declaring it the definitive proof that she introduced pasta to France on her wedding day. So, as you observe the French court, perhaps you see a few more forks than you might have a generation earlier, particularly in circles close to the Queen, but they are by no means common. Their journey into French society is just beginning, and it will face its own set of Gallic resistances and reinterpretations. Catherine de' Medici undoubtedly left a significant mark on French culture in many ways, from cuisine to architecture, but her role as the primary champion of the fork might be one of those historical attributions that is more legend than fully substantiated fact, a charming tale that simplifies a much more complex evolution of custom. The fork is still very much an outsider, looking in, even as Catherine de' Medici's Italian influence subtly weaves its way into French culture, introducing new flavors and perhaps a few more ornate serving dishes. The little fork she may or may not have championed still faces an uphill battle. You observe French society in the decades following her arrival, stretching well into the 17th century, and the prevailing attitude towards this utensil remains one of distinct Gallic skepticism, often mixed with a healthy dose of amusement. The fork, it seems, is struggling to convince the French that it's anything more than a rather silly Italian novelty. It's like that one guest at the party who is trying a bit too hard to impress with foreign phrases, only to be met with polite smiles and raised eyebrows. You witness scenes not just at court, but perhaps in the boisterous inns and the more modest noble houses. While a few daring individuals, perhaps those who have traveled to Italy or wish to appear particularly avant-garde, might occasionally be seen experimenting with a fork, the general populace, and indeed many among the nobility, continue to rely on the age-old combination of fingers, knives, and spoons. The mainstream historical fact is that for much of the 16th and even into the 17th centuries in France, the fork was widely viewed with suspicion or outright mockery. It was often considered an effeminate tool, particularly unsuitable for men, who were expected to engage with their food in a more direct, robust manner. Using a fork could mark a man as a dandy, someone overly concerned with frivolous refinements rather than manly pursuits. Imagine a brawny French duke, his hands perfectly capable of tearing a capon limb from limb, being presented with a delicate, two-tined fork. He might eye it with the same disdain he'd reserve for a piece of flimsy poetry or an overly perfumed handkerchief. "What is this thimble stabber?" he might exclaim. "Am I a child unable to convey meat to my mouth without assistance?" The very idea of needing such an intermediary was, to some, an insult to their natural dexterity. It was seen as an unnecessary affectation, a sign that one was perhaps putting on airs, trying to be more Italian than the Italians, and in France that wasn't always seen as a compliment. There was a certain national pride in their own established customs, a feeling that French ways were perfectly adequate, thank you very much. Why complicate the simple pleasure of eating with these foreign fiddlesticks? For a quirky and revealing tidbit, satirical literature and plays of the period often lampooned men who adopted the fork. These characters were frequently portrayed as foppish, overly delicate, and comically inept, struggling to manage the utensil, while more sensible, traditionally minded characters looked on with scornful amusement. There are even accounts suggesting that some French kings, figures who set the tone for courtly behavior, were not early adopters. King Henry IV, for instance, who reigned at the turn of the 17th century, was known for his earthy manners and reportedly preferred to use his fingers. If the king himself wasn't bothering with this newfangled device, it certainly didn't encourage his courtiers to rush out and acquire their own. It's hard to spearhead a trend when the head of state thinks your trendy new tool is basically a toothpick with ambition. Social historians continue to analyze the complex reasons behind France's prolonged resistance to the fork, weighing factors like established culinary traditions, which perhaps featured fewer of the sticky, syrupy dishes that made forks appealing in parts of Italy, deeply entrenched concepts of French masculinity, and even a possible element of cultural pushback against the perceived dominance of Italian refinement. Was it a genuine belief that forks were impractical, or was it a subconscious desire to assert a distinct French identity, free from excessive Italianate influences? Perhaps it was simply the inertia of habit, the comfort of doing things the way they had always been done. After all, learning to use a fork gracefully when you're accustomed to the tactile feedback of fingers requires a bit of practice, and who wants to look clumsy in front of their peers? Especially if those peers are just waiting for an excuse to call you a précieux ridicule. You can almost hear the conversations, the gentle and not so gentle teasing. Look at Jean-Luc trying to eat his pâté with that thing. He'll poke his eye out before he gets a decent mouthful. Or perhaps a more pointed, "Heard you were seen using one of those Italian fourchettes, Pierre. Planning on embroidering doilies next?" The social pressure to conform could be significant. It wasn't just about personal preference. It was about fitting in, about adhering to the accepted norms of your social circle. Using a fork too ostentatiously could be a risky social maneuver, inviting ridicule rather than admiration. It makes you wonder if French chefs of the time deliberately created dishes so incredibly delicious and structurally challenging that they defied any attempt at delicate fork eating, almost as a patriotic act, forcing everyone back to the more reliable methods. Try eating this cassoulet with your tiny spear, monsieur. So, while the seeds of fork acceptance might have been sown, possibly by Catherine's entourage or through other trickles of Italian contact, they fell on rather stony Gallic ground for a long while. The mockery persisted, the resistance was real, and the fork remained for many Frenchmen and women an amusing but ultimately unnecessary foreign curiosity. Its journey to becoming an indispensable part of the French table setting, so iconic in later centuries, was clearly going to be a marathon, not a sprint, paved with gentle derision and a steadfast attachment to the old ways. The fork was learning that winning over France would require more than just a royal introduction. It would require a fundamental shift in cultural attitudes. Your attention now drifts across the choppy waters of the English Channel, leaving behind the land of persistent Gallic shrugs and ironic smiles. You find yourself on the shores of early 17th century England, a nation of burgeoning maritime power, Shakespearean drama, and a hearty, no-nonsense approach to most things, including, it would seem, dining. If the French were skeptical of the fork, the English initially were about to take that skepticism, douse it in ale, and serve it up with a side of outright mockery, largely thanks to the efforts of one rather eccentric and enthusiastic traveler. Prepare to meet Thomas Coryat, a man on a mission, a self-appointed apostle of the Italian fork. It's around the year 1608. You see Thomas Coryat, a somewhat quirky scholar and gentleman embarking on a grand walking tour of Europe. He's an observant fellow, and when he reaches Italy, he is particularly struck by a peculiar local custom. The Italians, at least the more refined among them, are using a small pronged instrument to convey food to their mouths, thus avoiding the direct and sometimes messy contact of fingers with victuals. This, to Coryat, is a revelation. He sees it not as an affectation, but as a wonderfully civilized innovation. The mainstream historical fact is that upon his return to England, Thomas Coryat enthusiastically documented this practice in his famously titled travelogue, Coryat's Crudities, published in 1611. He didn't just write about it, he actively tried to introduce and champion the use of the fork in his homeland, believing it to be a mark of sophisticated dining. England, however, was not immediately convinced. In fact, England thought it was hilarious. Imagine Coryat, back from his continental adventures, perhaps at a boisterous English dinner. He produces his own fork, a necessity, as you wouldn't typically find them provided. He then proceeds to demonstrate its use, spearing a piece of meat or fruit with what he considers Italianate grace. Instead of impressed gasps, he's met with guffaws, perplexed stares, and a barrage of teasing. His attempts to promote this dainty foreign habit were largely seen as utterly absurd, pretentious, and frankly a bit un-English. It's as if he'd returned from abroad suggesting everyone should wear their hats backward and communicate only in sonnets. It was just too much of a departure from ingrained custom. For a truly quirky and telling tidbit, Coryat earned himself some rather pointed nicknames for his troubles. One of the most famous was Furcifer. Now, this Latin term literally means fork-bearer, which was accurate enough. However, Furcifer also carried the rather less complimentary connotation of rascal, scoundrel, or gallows bird. Someone deserving of being tied to a furca, a fork-shaped yoke used for punishment. So, while he was indeed bearing a fork, his critics were also slyly calling him a bit of a rogue or a fool. It takes a special kind of dedication to continue your crusade when your chosen moniker is basically that weirdo with the fork, who's also a bit of a dodgy character. He was, in essence, the 17th century equivalent of that one friend who comes back from a gap year with a questionable new accent and an insistence on only eating artisanal street food. Literary historians and sociologists still ponder whether Coryat's enthusiastic but somewhat eccentric advocacy, which drew so much personal mockery, ultimately helped plant the seed for the fork's eventual acceptance in England, or if his flamboyant, almost missionary-like efforts actually hindered its progress by associating it so strongly with his own perceived oddity. Did his crudities and his public fork-wielding make people curious? Or did it simply confirm their suspicions that this was all just some foreign nonsense imported by a man known for his peculiarities? It's a gentle debate, like wondering if a particularly loud town crier helps or hinders the message he's trying to convey. You can almost picture the scene at the Mermaid Tavern, or some similar haunt of wits and writers. Ben Jonson and his cronies might have had a field day with good Master Coryat and his Italian stylings. They might have penned satirical verses about his fork, suggesting it was a new type of loot pick, a tool for scratching one's periwig, or perhaps even a dangerous weapon in the hands of someone so clearly out of touch with sensible English ways. The English, much like their French counterparts, held strong views on masculinity, and for many, delicately picking at one's food with a tiny metal prong seemed utterly at odds with the ideal of a robust English gentleman. It was probably seen as something that might lead to other questionable continental habits like an appreciation for opera or, heaven forbid, an insufficient consumption of roast beef. Coryat's Lonely Crusade highlights just how deeply ingrained eating habits were and how resistant to change they could be, especially when the proposed change came with baggage of foreignness and perceived effeminacy. He wasn't just introducing a tool, he was challenging a whole set of cultural norms around food, conviviality, and national identity. He was, in a way, an accidental anthropologist, encountering a different material culture and trying to bring a piece of it home, only to find that his souvenir was viewed more as a curiosity to be mocked than an innovation to be embraced. The fork, under Coryat's well-intentioned but somewhat comical championship, stumbled badly on England's shores, proving that even the most practical of tools can face a tough crowd if it doesn't understand the local sense of humor. Its journey into English acceptance would be, like its French counterpart, a slow and winding one, largely unhelped by its first, most vocal and most ridiculed English fan. The good-natured, if somewhat pointed English mockery of poor Thomas Coryat and his beloved fork begins to soften in your awareness, not because England suddenly had a fork epiphany, but because your perspective is now broadening, encompassing the wider European stage throughout the 17th century. It's a period of immense change, of Baroque grandeur, scientific discoveries, and shifting political landscapes. And amidst all this, almost imperceptibly at first, our persistent little utensil is slowly, very slowly, starting to gain a more secure footing. The outright laughter is perhaps fading into a more considered, if still sometimes reluctant, curiosity. It's like a catchy tune that you initially dismiss, but then find yourself humming days later. The fork is gradually working its way into the European consciousness. You observe the courts of kings and the tables of wealthy merchants from Paris to Padua, perhaps even venturing into parts of the Holy Roman Empire or the grander households of Spain. The mainstream historical fact is that throughout the 17th century, fork usage did indeed increase, especially among the aristocracy and the burgeoning affluent classes. What was once a rare Italian oddity or a Byzantine whisper is now becoming a more familiar, though still far from universal, sight. Crucially, the fork itself begins to evolve. Remember those dainty, often two-tined implements? Designers, or perhaps just practical-minded silversmiths, started to experiment. First, a third tine was added, and then, towards the end of the century and into the early 18th, a fourth. This was a game-changer. With 3 or 4 tines, the fork became significantly more practical. It wasn't just for delicately spearing a piece of fruit anymore. It could actually hold food more securely, and even assist in scooping up morsels, making it a much more versatile and useful companion to the knife and spoon. People probably finally realized that trying to balance a pea on 2 prongs was a recipe for tabletop tragedy and hungry pets. This increase in tines also subtly shifted the fork's function. While a 2-tined fork is primarily a stabbing instrument, a 3- or 4-tined fork, especially if the tines are slightly curved, can act a bit like a shallow spoon. This made it more adept at handling a wider variety of foods, from small, cut pieces of meat to cooked vegetables. It's a bit like upgrading from a biplane to a more advanced aircraft. The core concept is the same, but the improved design dramatically expands its capabilities. One can only imagine the intense design committee meetings. Gentlemen, I propose a third T. The world will never be the same. The sheer audacity. Now, for a quirky and rather charming example of this era's cutlery innovation, the sucket fork. This was a delightful little hybrid, a utensil typically featuring a spoon at one end and a small, 2-tined fork at the other. Its specific purpose was for eating suckets, pieces of fruit preserved in syrup, a popular sweetmeat at the time. You could use the spoon end to ladle out a bit of the syrup and the fork end to spear the fruit itself. It's a wonderful example of a tool evolving to meet a very specific culinary need, a testament to humanity's ongoing quest to consume sticky desserts with maximum efficiency and minimal mess. It also shows that the fork wasn't just a general-purpose tool yet. Sometimes it needed a specific job description to get invited to the table. Of course, the adoption wasn't uniform. In some regions and among some social groups, the fork was embraced more readily than in others. Italy remained ahead of the curve, but even in France, despite the earlier mockery you witnessed, its use was slowly becoming more accepted in high society, particularly later in the century. In England, the process was perhaps even more glacial, but the seeds sown by travelers and the increasing contact with continental fashions were beginning to germinate, however slowly. You might still find staunch traditionalists who declare that God gave them 10 good fingers and they intended to use them, but their numbers were, ever so gradually, dwindling, at least in polite company. They were becoming the early modern equivalent of someone insisting on using a flip phone in the age of smartphones. Admirably committed, perhaps, but increasingly out of step. Culinary historians continue to map the precise diffusion patterns of fork adoption across Europe in the 17th century, debating the relative importance of influences like the fashions of prominent royal courts, such as the increasingly influential French court, especially as Louis XIV's reign progressed. Evolving culinary styles that perhaps favored smaller, more manageable pieces of food, requiring less aggressive knife work, or changing societal concepts of hygiene and refinement. Was it the desire to emulate a king, the need to manage a new type of ragout, or a growing squeamishness about communal hand-dipping that finally tipped the scales in the fork's favor? The answer is likely a complex blend of all these factors, a slow marination of society in new ideas and practices. You observe a dinner where forks, now perhaps with 3 tines, are more visibly present. People are still learning. There might be a certain self-consciousness in how they are held, a carefulness that betrays their novelty for some. Etiquette around their use would have been developing too, perhaps unwritten rules about not gesturing too wildly with your fork, or, as some suggest, the polite convention of not leaving the tines pointing upwards when resting the utensil, lest it look like a tiny, aggressive trident challenging your dining companions. The journey is far from over, but the 17th century marks a definite shift. The fork is moving from being an exotic curiosity, an object of ridicule or affectation, towards becoming a more normalized, if still somewhat elite, part of the European dining experience. The tines are multiplying, and so too, slowly, are its users. The gentle clinking of evolving European silverware and the murmur of courtly debate over tines and etiquette begin to recede, as your journey takes a great leap westward, across the vast, churning Atlantic. You find yourself on the rugged, windswept shores of early colonial America, sometime in the 17th or early 18th century. The air here is crisp, tinged with the scent of pine forests, wood smoke, and the sea. Life is different here. The focus is on survival, on carving out an existence in a new, often unforgiving land. The elaborate rituals and burgeoning refinements of European dining rooms seem a world away. And our friend the fork? Well, in this new context, it's less of an aspiring socialite and more of a rarely seen, slightly bewildered country cousin. You observe a colonial household. The dwelling might be a simple wooden structure, sturdy but unadorned. The table is likely a plain, heavy board, and the meal, while hearty, is straightforward. Here, the mainstream historical fact is that early American colonists possessed very few eating utensils by European standards. Knives and spoons were the primary tools, considered essential. Forks, however, were a distinct rarity. If a household possessed a fork at all, it was often a single cherished item, perhaps brought over from the Old World, or a very basic, locally made implement with just two prongs, fashioned from iron, steel, or sometimes pewter. It certainly wasn't the norm for each diner to have their own. You'd be more likely to find a family sharing a single mug than each having their own personal fork. It was a bit like having a single communal remote control for the entire village. You used it when you absolutely had to, and with great care. The knife was the true workhorse of the colonial table, and indeed of colonial life. It was used to cut meat, often eaten directly from the knife or with fingers, to spear food, and it served countless other purposes beyond the meal, from skinning game to whittling wood, to perhaps even a bit of impromptu dentistry, if things got really dire. Spoons, too, were indispensable for porridges, stews, and anything liquid. Compared to these multi-talented stalwarts, the fork, especially a simple two-pronged one, might have seemed like a rather specialized, almost superfluous tool. What could it do that a knife point and a set of reasonably clean fingers couldn't manage, especially when there were fields to plow and defenses to maintain? Colonists probably had more pressing concerns, like whether that rustling in the woods was a deer for dinner or a bear looking for dinner, than agonizing over the correct fork for their succotash. A revealing and quirky tidbit comes from examining probate inventories of early colonial estates, those meticulous lists of a person's belongings made after their passing. These documents frequently show entries for multiple spoons, often silver if the family was well off, or pewter and wood for others, and knives, but forks are strikingly scarce. Sometimes you might see a listing for a fork or 2 old forks, indicating they were not common enough to be taken for granted. Occasionally, you might find mention of a campaign set, a knife, fork, and spoon designed to fold or fit together compactly, ideal for travelers or soldiers. This again underscores the fork's status as something of a specialty item, not yet a standard feature of the domestic scene. It was the kind of thing you took with you if you were going somewhere, not necessarily something you expected to find waiting for you on every table. Archaeologists and material culture historians examining early colonial sites debate whether the scarcity of forks reflects purely economic constraints. Settlers understandably brought only the most essential items and had limited resources to acquire non-essentials. A conscious or unconscious rejection of what they perceived as European aristocratic luxury and affectation in favor of simpler, more virtuous living, or simply a slower adoption curve influenced by the different culinary practices and the demanding practicalities of frontier life. Were they making a statement against old-world decadence, or did they just not have the time, money, or inclination to bother with what seemed like a fussy little implement when a good knife did most of the job? Perhaps they looked at a fork and thought, right, another thing to make, another thing to clean, another thing for young Timothy to lose in the creek. No, thank you. You might see a colonist, if they possessed a fork, using it in a very straightforward manner, perhaps to hold a piece of salt pork steady while cutting it, or to spear a boiled potato. There would be none of the elaborate flourishing or intricate etiquette that was beginning to develop in European courts. The fork here was a tool, plain and simple. And if it was an all-purpose fork, it might have stirred the pot, fished out a dumpling, and then conveyed it to the mouth, fostering a certain unpretentious unity between cooking and eating. One can only hope it got a quick wipe on a homespun napkin in between tasks. You certainly wouldn't find anyone in a rough-hewn cabin in the Massachusetts Bay Colony worrying if they were holding their fork tines up or down. They were probably more concerned with keeping the squirrels out of the cornmeal. So, while Europe was gradually adding more tines and slowly refining fork etiquette, colonial America represented a significant step back in terms of the fork's prevalence and complexity. It was a return to basics, a world where utility trumped elegance, and where the humble fork, if present at all, was a simple, often solitary implement, far from the glittering, multi-tined status symbols it was becoming in the grander dining rooms across the ocean. The fork's American journey was starting from a very different place, one of rugged simplicity and pragmatism. The image of that lone, often rudimentary fork on the colonial American table begins to recede, replaced by a scene of increasing polish and, dare we say, elegance. Your journey now ushers you more fully into the 18th century, a period of Enlightenment ideals, burgeoning trade, and a growing refinement in social manners, not just in the grand salons of Europe, but also in the more established and prosperous households of the American colonies. The fork, once a guest struggling for an invitation, is now finding a proper and often quite ornate place setting. It's as if, after centuries of awkward auditions, it's finally landed a starring role, complete with a supporting cast of matching spoons and knives. You find yourself observing dining rooms that gleam with candlelight reflecting off polished mahogany and, significantly, silverware. The mainstream historical fact is that the 18th century, particularly its latter half, saw the definitive rise of matching sets of dining cutlery. No longer was it just a personal knife and spoon with perhaps a shared or rare fork. Now, affluent families in London, Paris, Philadelphia, and Boston increasingly aspired to own and display coordinated sets of knives, spoons, and forks. These forks are no longer the simple two-pronged implements of yore. They now commonly boast 3 or, increasingly, 4 gracefully curved tines, making them far more adept at both spearing and scooping. This wasn't just a change in tools. It was part of a broader shift towards more formalized and elaborate dining rituals. People finally had enough forks to go around, which must have been a great relief, preventing those awkward moments of surreptitiously wiping the communal fork on your breeches before passing it to your great-aunt. The craftsmanship of these items is often exquisite, Silversmiths like Paul Revere in America, or their counterparts in Europe, were creating beautiful pieces often adorned with family crests or fashionable decorative motifs. For a quirky and stylish tidbit from this era, consider the popularity of pistol grip handles for knives and forks. These handles, shaped somewhat like the butt of an antique pistol, were not only elegant but also offered a comfortable and secure grip. They became a hallmark of fine 18th century tableware, reflecting the Rococo and later neoclassical design sensibilities of the time. Imagine your host resplendent in powdered wig and silk waistcoat, gesturing with a pistol-gripped fork. It adds a certain theatrical flair to requesting the salt. With more utensils gracing the table, a new field of social navigation emerged: cutlery etiquette. While not yet reaching the dizzying complexity of the Victorian era, the 18th century saw the beginnings of codified rules about how to arrange and use these growing sets. Which fork was for the main course? Was there a smaller one for dessert? How should they be placed when not in use? These were questions that increasingly occupied the minds of socially ambitious hosts and hostesses. It was the dawn of that delightful anxiety of wondering if you're about to commit a horrifying faux pas by picking up the wrong shiny implement. One can almost hear the whispered instructions from a mother to her daughter. "No, dear, that fork is for the fish, the other one for the roast. And try not to use it like you're harpooning a whale." Material culture. Historians debate the exact point in the 18th century at which owning a matched set of silverware transitioned from being an indicator of significant aristocratic or mercantile wealth to a more widespread aspiration for the burgeoning middle class, and how this varied by region. Was it mid-century or later, as industrial innovations began to make such goods slightly more accessible? And did this aspiration trickle down from the nobility, or was it also driven by a newly wealthy merchant class eager to display their success? It's a subtle shift, like the changing tide, hard to pinpoint to a single moment, but undeniable in its overall effect. One thing is for certain: the presence of a gleaming array of matching silverware, prominently displayed, became a clear signal of a family's status and their participation in a more refined cosmopolitan world. You observe a dinner party. The conversation flows, perhaps touching upon the latest philosophical ideas from Europe, or the stirring political developments in the American colonies. The table is a landscape of carefully arranged plates, sparkling glassware, and, of course, the ranks of silverware. The food itself is often served in successive courses, each potentially requiring a fresh set of cutlery. This is a far cry from the communal bowls and trenchers of centuries past, or even the basic individual settings of the more recent colonial era. This is dining as a performance, a social ritual that underscores order, elegance, and a certain well-mannered distance from the more primal aspects of eating. Does the food taste demonstrably better when eaten with a perfectly matched, pistol-gripped silver fork from a dedicated set? Perhaps not intrinsically, but the experience, the sheer civility of it all, certainly elevated the occasion, and probably made your neighbors wonderfully, if quietly, envious. The fork, now often made of silver, sometimes steel for more everyday use, has truly arrived. It is no longer an oddity, no longer solely for the most elite or the most eccentric. It is becoming an expected part of a proper table setting in prosperous homes. Its design is stabilizing, its utility is unquestioned, and its presence signals a certain level of sophistication. The journey from a scandalous foreign implement to an emblem of 18th century elegance has been long and winding, but the fork, with its newly acquired tines and its matching companions, is now firmly established, ready for whatever culinary and social complexities the next century might bring. The calm, orderly arrangements of 18th century silverware, which seemed so elegant and complete, now begin to multiply, to branch out, to positively proliferate as your awareness drifts into the 19th century. You find yourself in the midst of the Victorian era, a time of industrial marvels, imperial expansion, and an almost obsessive attention to propriety, detail, and elaborate social ritual. And nowhere is this more evident than on the dining table, where our friend the fork, having finally achieved widespread acceptance, now decides to specialize. And specialize, and then specialize a little bit more, just for good measure. It's as if the fork, having been a general practitioner for so long, suddenly decided to become a highly specific consultant for every single ailment on the menu. You are seated at a grand Victorian dinner party. The table stretches before you, a dazzling, almost intimidating landscape of polished silver. The mainstream historical fact of this period is the astonishing explosion in the variety of eating utensils, particularly forks. It wasn't enough to simply have a dinner fork anymore. Oh no. The Victorians, with their love for categorization and their burgeoning manufacturing capabilities, devised a unique fork for practically every dish imaginable. There were fish forks, often with a wide tine and an elegant shape to flake the fish, fruit forks, smaller, sometimes with a little spur, pastry forks, delicate for those elaborate desserts, oyster forks, sturdy, three-pronged, for wrestling mollusks from their shells, asparagus forks or tongs, for gracefully conveying a single spear, sardine forks, berry forks, ice cream forks, often spade-shaped, and even stranger, more specific creations. It was a fork for every season, and a fork for every reason. The sheer number of implements at a single place setting could be utterly bewildering. You might find yourself confronted with a gleaming phalanx of silver, a dozen or more pieces arranged in a precise, almost militant order. For a quirky and anxiety-inducing tidbit, this led to what could only be described as fork anxiety. Guests, particularly those less accustomed to the dizzying heights of Victorian society, would live in fear of committing a dreadful utensil-related gaffe. Which fork was for the jellied consommé? Which for the poached salmon? Which for the spun sugar confection that looked too beautiful to eat? Using the wrong fork was not just a minor slip-up. It could be a social death sentence, a clear indicator that you simply didn't belong. One can imagine guests desperately trying to catch the eye of the hostess or subtly watching their more confident neighbors before daring to pick up anything. You almost needed a butler whispering in your ear like a culinary GPS. In 200 feet, make a slight right to the shellfish fork. You might encounter some truly niche items that stretch the very definition of necessity. Consider the dedicated lettuce fork, often with a single broad tine, designed apparently because ordinary forks were too aggressive for delicate greens. Or the macaroni fork, a wide, somewhat scoop-like implement with blunted tines, intended to gracefully manage slippery pasta strands, a problem the Italians had by then largely solved with different fork designs or just superior technique. It sometimes felt as if the primary function of these myriad forks was not so much to eat the food, but to demonstrate the host's wealth and the guest's sophisticated knowledge of an increasingly arcane set of rules. The terror of being the first to select a fork from the gleaming arsenal must have been palpable. Perhaps someone should have invented a fork selection anxiety fork, just to help people cope. Social commentators and historians of etiquette still discuss whether the Victorian zeal for hyper-specialized cutlery was primarily driven by genuine perceived functional distinctions for each food type. Did a sardine really require its own uniquely shaped fork to be properly consumed? Or was it more a manifestation of the powerful bourgeois desire for conspicuous consumption and social differentiation through elaborate displays of wealth and intricate insider knowledge? Or perhaps more cynically, was it fueled by the silver manufacturers' eagerness to create and exploit new markets by continually inventing new needs for their increasingly complex and expensive wares? Madam, You simply cannot serve your esteemed guests mangoes without the latest silver-gilt mango fork. It's simply not done. The fork, in its Victorian incarnation, became a symbol. It was a marker of class, of refinement, or the aspiration to it, and of participation in a highly structured social game. The sheer variety was a testament to the era's industrial capacity. Silver plating techniques made ornate silverware more accessible to the expanding middle class, who were often eager to emulate aristocratic customs. The designs themselves were often incredibly elaborate, featuring intricate floral patterns, scrolling S-curves, and heavily ornamented handles, reflecting the Victorian love of decorative excess. Sometimes you feel the decoration was more important than the tines. As you gaze upon this bewildering array, this silver forest, you can't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with a touch of sleepy amusement. The journey from a simple two-pronged implement, viewed with suspicion and mockery, to this intricate, specialized, and socially charged collection is truly remarkable. The fork has not just arrived, it has brought all its relatives, and they all expect their own specific seat at the table. Navigating a Victorian dinner was less a meal and more an examination in applied silversmithing and social strategy. But fear not, for even this peak of fork complexity will eventually give way to simpler times, though not before leaving an indelible mark on our perception of what it means to dine in style. The almost bewildering array of specialized forks on the high Victorian table, once the exclusive domain of the wealthy and the socially ambitious, begins to undergo a subtle but profound transformation in your perception. It's not that the elaborate styles vanish overnight, but rather that the very idea of owning a fork, or indeed a whole set of them, starts to ripple outwards from the grand dining rooms and into the homes of a much wider populace. This momentous shift is powered by the relentless, smoky, and often noisy engine of the Industrial Revolution, which chugs and clangs its way through the 19th century and into the early 20th, changing not just how goods are made, but who gets to own them. The fork is about to go mainstream, thanks to the factory. You can almost hear the rhythmic thud of steam hammers, the whir of new machinery, the sizzle of molten metal. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Industrial Revolution brought about revolutionary manufacturing techniques that dramatically altered cutlery production. Processes like machine stamping, where fork blanks could be cut from sheets of metal with speed and precision, and the invention of electroplating in the 1840s, which allowed a thin, durable layer of silver to be deposited over a base metal, made forks significantly cheaper to produce than their handcrafted solid silver or laboriously forged steel predecessors. Suddenly, owning a respectable set of forks was no longer a dream reserved for the landed gentry or prosperous merchants. It was becoming an attainable aspiration for the growing middle class and even for many working-class families. It was a quiet democratization of the dinner table. Now, everyone could potentially experience the mild confusion of whether to use the salad fork or the dinner fork first, a privilege once reserved for the elite. This newfound accessibility didn't mean that everyone instantly owned dozens of specialized Victorian forks, of course, but a basic set, dinner forks, perhaps some smaller ones, alongside knives and spoons, became a common feature in many more homes. For a quirky and fascinating tidbit, consider the rise of new materials and marketing methods. German silver, also known as nickel silver, an alloy of copper, nickel, and zinc, became a popular base metal for electroplating. It looked good, was durable, and far more affordable than solid silver. Later, as the 19th century waned and the 20th dawned, the invention and gradual adoption of stainless steel would provide another corrosion-resistant, practical, and relatively inexpensive option. Furthermore, mail-order catalogs, pioneered by companies like Sears, Roebuck, and Comey in the United States, allowed even families in remote rural areas to browse and purchase entire sets of presentable cutlery, bringing a touch of modern convenience and aspiration right to their doorstep. Imagine the excitement in a modest farmhouse when the parcel containing their first proper set of shiny forks and spoons arrived. It was more than just metal. It was a symbol of progress, of participating in a wider modern world. You can picture the subtle shift in domestic scenes. A working-class family, perhaps, sitting down to their Sunday dinner, the table laid not just with plates and spoons, but with their own set of matching machine-made forks. Perhaps not as ornate as those in a nobleman's mansion, but clean, functional, and theirs. The pride in such an acquisition, the sense of respectability it conferred, was a significant social development. The old handcrafted silver forks, if they could think, might have looked down their elegant handles at these new, mass-produced upstarts. But they couldn't deny their growing numbers. The revolution was not just in the factories, it was on the dinner tables of ordinary people. Economic historians and sociologists continue to chart the complex relationship between the mass production of consumer goods, like cutlery during the Industrial Revolution and its impact on domestic life, the shaping of social aspirations for decency and respectability, and the shifting definitions of necessity versus luxury for ordinary families across different industrialized nations. Did having a fork for everyone at the table subtly change family dynamics or the perception of mealtime? Did it encourage different types of cooking or eating? And how did manufacturers convince people that this item, once a rare luxury, was now an everyday essential? They probably pitched it as the key to a happy home, a well-ordered life, and quite possibly improved digestion. The timeless tactics of advertising. The sheer availability of these mass-produced forks also meant that the general standards of table etiquette, once the preserve of the upper classes who could afford the requisite tools, began to filter down, albeit in simplified forms. Knowing how to use a knife and fork correctly became a more widespread marker of good manners, something taught to children in a broader range of households. Of course, this also meant that the potential for fork-related faux pas also became more democratic, though perhaps with less severe social consequences than in Queen Victoria's grandest dining rooms. So, the Industrial Revolution, with its clatter and smoke, effectively took the fork from the display cabinet of the elite and placed it into the kitchen drawer of the many. It might have lost some of its handcrafted uniqueness, some of its snob appeal in the process, but it gained an unprecedented reach. The fork was no longer just a symbol of wealth or extreme refinement. It was becoming a basic tool for civilized eating for an ever-increasing number of people. Its journey towards ubiquity was now well and truly underway, powered by steam and the promise of affordable elegance for all. The hum and clatter of the 19th century factories, which brought the fork to the masses, gradually transitions into the more complex soundscape of the 20th century. You find yourself drifting through an era marked by world wars, unprecedented technological leaps, social revolutions, and the dawn of a truly globalized world. Amidst these seismic shifts, our friend the fork, having survived its Victorian phase of almost Baroque complexity, now settles into a more standardized, practical, and widely accepted form. It's as if, after a period of wild experimentation and showing off all its possible mutations, the fork finally decided on its most comfortable and efficient everyday attire. You observe dining tables from the early 1900s through the post-war boom and into the later decades. The mainstream historical fact is that the 20th century witnessed a significant simplification and standardization of fork design. The bewildering array of specialized Victorian forks, the sardine prongs, the lettuce spears, the macaroni scoops, largely faded from common use, much to the relief, no doubt, of dinner guests everywhere. Etiquette streamlined and the typical place setting in Western cultures generally coalesced around a few key pieces: a dinner fork, perhaps a smaller salad, or dessert fork, and their trusty companions, the knife and spoon. Stainless steel, with its resistance to rust and tarnish, its durability, and its affordability, became the dominant material, making forks truly accessible and easy to maintain for almost everyone. Fork usage became near universal in Western societies, an unquestioned part of daily meals, from humble diners to elegant restaurants. It finally felt like the fork could relax. Its place was secure. What also marks this century is the fork's accelerated journey across the globe. As international travel became more common, as cultures interconnected through media and migration, and as Western dining styles were exported or adopted in various contexts, the fork ventured far beyond its European and American strongholds. Restaurants in bustling Asian cities, hotels in newly independent African nations, and homes in South America all began to feature this once exotic implement, sometimes alongside traditional eating tools, sometimes replacing them for certain types of cuisine or occasions. It was a culinary ambassador, whether it intended to be or not. Of course, some cultures looked at this pointy metal stick and probably thought, with perfect justification, "You really expect us to manage our delicious noodles, rice abdir stew, with this thing? Have you seen chopstick/hands injera bread?" For a quirky and surprisingly enduring tidbit from this era, consider the invention and persistence of the spork. Patented in various forms from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this spoon-fork hybrid, often made of plastic in its later incarnations, became the utilitarian champion of specific niches. You'll find it in fast food restaurants, school cafeterias, prisons on camping trips, and in airline meal trays. The spork is like the fork's minimalist cousin who decided that all that specialization was just too much fuss and tried to be everything at once, a scoop and a stabber in one slightly awkward but undeniably efficient package. It's the fork's attempt to prove it could still be an overachiever, but this time in the field of extreme practicality. Cultural anthropologists and food sociologists continue to examine the complex ways in which the adoption of Western cutlery, including the fork, has interacted with traditional eating practices and culinary identities in non-Western cultures throughout the 20th century and beyond, exploring themes of adaptation, resistance, and hybridity. It's rarely a simple case of one tool replacing another. Often, it's a more nuanced story of coexistence, of using forks for some meals and traditional methods for others, or of adapting the fork itself to suit local foods and customs. The fork's global spread is not a monologue, but a conversation with many different accents and replies. Subtle variations in what constitutes a standard fork also persist. For instance, the typical American dinner fork often has broader, somewhat flatter tines compared to its European counterpart, which might be slightly more delicate or have a more pronounced curve. And then there's the whole fascinating microculture of eating styles. The American style, or zigzag method, of cutting food with the knife in the right hand and fork in the left, then placing the knife down and switching the fork to the right hand to eat, versus the European style, or continental style, where the fork generally remains in the left hand for eating, tines often pointed downwards, with the knife in the right assisting. These little differences are like regional dialects for fork usage, adding a quiet layer of diversity to its otherwise standardized existence. So, the 20th century sees the fork achieve a kind of comfortable ubiquity in many parts of the world. It's no longer a novelty, no longer a subject of intense debate or ridicule, no longer a complex puzzle of a dozen specialized forms. It has become, for many, simply the fork. A dependable, unassuming tool that helps us eat our meals with a degree of civility and efficiency. Its journey has been long and surprisingly eventful, but it seems to have found its rhythm, a quiet, clinking presence on tables around the globe, a testament to its enduring, practical design. And so, after that long, meandering, and surprisingly eventful journey through centuries of clinking metal, heated debate, and sticky fingers, you find yourself back in a time that feels much like your own. The echoes of Byzantine courts, Venetian scandals, Renaissance anxieties, French mockery, English eccentricity, Victorian excess, and industrial clatter all gently settle around you. You reach for an eating utensil, perhaps without a second thought, and there it is, the humble modern fork. It rests in your hand, cool and familiar, a quiet testament to its epic, globe-spanning, time-traveling adventure. It's funny, isn't it, how we now take this everyday object so completely for granted after all the drama it's been through? It probably sits in your kitchen drawer, just dreaming of the days when it caused international incidents or required a user manual thicker than a novel. The fork, as you generally encounter it today, typically crafted from durable stainless steel, usually sporting 3 or 4 well-proportioned tines, is indeed the mainstream result of all that historical trial and error. Its basic form for most Western-style dining has become remarkably stable, a quiet acknowledgement of its functional elegance. Minor innovations continue, of course. You might find forks made of lightweight titanium for camping, or with ergonomically designed handles for enhanced comfort, or perhaps in a rainbow of fashionable colors. But the fundamental design, that balanced combination of spearing capability and modest scooping assistance, has largely been perfected for its common tasks. It's the quiet honor student who, after a rebellious youth, finally settled down and became exceptionally good at its job. Yet, even in our age of standardization, the fork hasn't entirely lost its capacity for niche specialization or artistic flair. For a quirky little insight, there's still a world out there for the true fork aficionado. You can find collectors cherishing antique Victorian fish forks with their elaborate engravings, or contemporary chefs commissioning bespoke utensils for unique culinary creations. Some designers even create art forks, more sculpture than utensil, challenging our perception of its form and function. And for the truly curious, scientific studies occasionally explore how the weight, material, and even the shape of a fork's tines can subtly influence our perception of taste and texture. Imagine the fork not just as a vehicle for food, but as a subtle flavor enhancer. It's still got a few tricks up its metallic sleeve, it seems. Designers and ergonomists still occasionally propose revolutionary fork redesigns, perhaps with asymmetrical tines, integrated sensors, or handles that contort in new and wondrous ways, sparking discussions about whether the current dominant form is truly the pinnacle of eating utensil evolution, or simply the result of a long series of historical accidents, cultural preferences, and manufacturing conveniences. Is your everyday fork the ultimate design, or just the one that happened to win the historical lottery? It's a gentle question to ponder as you drift off. And let's not forget the spork, still out there in the wilderness of fast food and camping gear, valiantly trying to convince the world that it's the true multitasking champion. Bless its hybrid heart. From its ancient, spear-like ancestors, used for heavy lifting at the hearth, to the dainty, two-pronged symbols of Byzantine refinement that so shocked the early Venetians. From its hesitant adoption in Renaissance Italy, amidst whispers of affectation, to the outright mockery it faced in France, and from early English commentators like poor, ridiculed Thomas Coryat. Then came its gradual acceptance in the 17th century as practicality dawned and more tines appeared, its scarcity in the rugged simplicity of colonial America, followed by the rise of elegant matching sets in the 18th century. It endured the almost overwhelming extravaganza of Victorian specialization, before the Industrial Revolution made it accessible to nearly everyone, eventually leading to the standardized, globally recognized utensil of the 20th century that now rests so unassumingly on our tables. It has been quite the odyssey. This simple tool, once a catalyst for debates on morality, masculinity, and national identity, now just helps you eat your peas. It has weathered scorn, survived scandals, and adapted to countless culinary and cultural shifts. It has been a symbol of luxury, a mark of foreignness, an emblem of progress, and finally, a quiet, indispensable part of daily life for billions. And now, as our long, slow journey with this surprisingly storied utensil comes to a gentle close, allow your mind to soften, to let go of the details, the dates, the distant clatter of ancient feasts and Victorian dinner parties. Feel the comfortable weight of your own relaxation, the gentle pull of oncoming sleep. The story of the fork, with all its little prongs and historical pathways, is now just a soft murmur in the background. The path it took was winding, often unexpected, full of curious pauses and surprising accelerations, much like the path to slumber can sometimes be. Let the gentle rhythm of its history, the slow unfolding of its acceptance, merge with the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Each breath is an invitation to sink deeper, to become heavier, to drift more completely. The myriad forms it once took, the countless meals it has attended, now all blur into a single peaceful image of rest. There are no more debates to be had, no more etiquette to master, no more curious glances from across the table. There is only the quiet, the calm, and the soft embrace of the approaching night. The humble fork has found its place, and now it is time for you to find yours in the soothing depths of a good, sound sleep.